Whether your car has 100 horsepower or 1,000 horsepower, driving it over 100 miles an hour is the same in both situations. So one could argue that one of the most, if not the most important things you could do to your car if you're going to be driving it that fast is making sure that you can actually stop the car. And so what we're going to be doing in today's episode is installing some Hawk HT10 racing brake pads along with some Turner Motorsports stainless steel brake lines in an attempt to safely and reliably get this car out on track and driving at those speeds so we don't end up with an off-track situation. So enough talking, let's get into taking the brakes and rotors off of the car. Here we go. This is my 1997 E36 M3, and I've spent the better part of the past year prepping it to make its first ever appearance at the track. And although the car won't be competition ready anytime soon, that hasn't stopped me from trying to prepare the car with that mindset regardless. So among things like race ready suspension, new spherical bushings, an entirely new cooling system, and plenty more, the goal has always remained the same. Build a race-ready car that I could drive to the track, spend all day beating on it, then reliably drive it home. And so, in an attempt to lean a bit on the reliably beating part of that last sentence, in today's episode, I'm going to not only be refreshing the braking system, but also upgrade it a bit over what the OEM setup could handle. Now really quick, I recently discovered that less than 3% of you guys who are watching these videos are actually subscribed. So I wanted to kindly ask that if you are at all interested in supporting me in the making of these episodes, that you consider subscribing. It is the best way for me to gauge whether or not you guys are enjoying these videos. And so with that being said, now let's get back into the episode. Now, alongside the Hawk race pads and the Turner Motorsports stainless steel brake lines, I'm also going to flush out the old brake fluid from the car in order to replace it with this Motul RBF 600.4 brake fluid. The reason being is not only am I unsure how long this current fluid has been in the car, but we'll discuss a bit later in the episode why this ended up paying off in more ways than one. For now, step one is to remove as much of the old brake fluid from the system as I can with my vacuum brake bleeder that I brought home from work. Thankfully, this made quick work of anything I could reach inside of the brake fluid reservoir, and so following that, it's time to introduce another tool that makes bleeding brakes go from a two-person job to one that you can do on your own. I picked up this pressure brake bleeder from Amazon for about 50 bucks, and with it, I'm able to apply a small amount of pressure to the brake system, which will ultimately allow for a single person brake bleed procedure. Simply hook the bleeder up to the reservoir, apply a bit of pressure, and crack the bleed screws at each corner of the car, then let the pressure do the rest. However, for now, I'm using this as a way to try and flush the system of as much of the old brake fluid as possible before introducing any of the new brake fluid into the car. The thought process being that since this fluid is pretty expensive per bottle, I'd rather try and avoid any mixing of the old dirty fluid with the new fluid. So if I can have a near empty system to start, I can ensure that the fluid stays as fresh as possible for as long as possible. So after applying a bit of pressure to the system, I was able to let the driver's front corner bleed out until it stopped flowing any more fluid, at which point it was time to remove the old OEM brake line. Now this went about as smooth as I could have hoped, even despite purchasing a set of flare nut wrenches only to discover that the set didn't even have the right size that I needed, but still, thankfully, I was able to get every one of the 6 brake lines removed and installed with a regular open-ended box wrench without any rounded off nuts, which even I was surprised of considering how old the car is. So about as quickly as the OEM ones came out, the Turner ones went in, and once everything was tight and ready for fresh fluid, simply due to timing, I ended up putting a pause on the other 3 corners so I can get the rotors removed and prepared to take to my work. Now, this next part of the episode will likely ruffle some feathers because the reason I'm taking them to my work is so I can machine them. And I can already hear the keyboards typing and can only imagine all of the internet master mechanics who will argue that machining rotors is a waste of time, or that it ruins the rotors, or that you can't machine drilled and slotted rotors, or I'm gonna lose heat dissipation capabilities. Yeah. I want to remind everyone watching that I am an industry certified master mechanic who's been machining rotors with absolutely zero issues for over a decade. And I also want to remind you that when a manufacturer decides that they don't machine rotors, it's not because they can't. It's because it's quicker, safer, and also there's more money to be made selling rotors than there is machining them. Now, without getting too into the technicals, regarding the safety aspect that I mentioned, when I say it's safer, I'm referring to two things. First is regarding the person actually doing the machine work. Brake lathes are simple tools once you know how to use one, but if you don't, you can get seriously injured. And second, sure, a rotor that's machined can become unsafe to use, but that's only when the rotor is machined below the manufacturer's minimum thickness spec, which then yes, can affect braking characteristics. Now obviously I'm not talking about cars with carbon ceramics, that's a whole different topic entirely, but in my case, not only does the E36 M3 have minimum rotor thickness specs, but you can most definitely machine drilled and slotted rotors. And you're going to see in just a second why this was a necessary step anyways. Now as you saw before I started machining the rotors, there were grooves developing on them, which means that the rotor surface isn't perfectly flat, and even more apparent than the grooves is this right here. What you're seeing here is a clear indication that this rotor was warped. Now, I can't speak for everyone watching, but if you've ever been in a car or drove one when the car shook when applying the brakes, this right here is why that happens. This warping, and similar to the grooves, means that the face of the rotor isn't perfectly flat, which is absolutely a no-go for trying to stop from high speeds at the track, because this means that the face of the rotor isn't making full contact with the entire face of the brake pad, which obviously significantly reduces braking capabilities. So if at this point you aren't convinced, then I'm not sure what else I could do to sell you on the idea. And sure, buying new rotors would have accomplished the same thing, but why spend the money when I have the ability to machine off a few thousandths of an inch from each rotor and essentially have the same exact thing as new? And just because I have the footage, you can see here that the measurement for this front rotor after being machined is around 27.5 millimeters. And with the minimum OEM spec allowed at 26.4 millimeters, means that this is still closer to the new OEM spec of 28 millimeters than the minimum. So to all you rotor machine hating non-believers, hopefully this helps you decide to save a couple of bucks on your next brake job. Alright, rant over. I'm done with the machining rotors lesson. Now that we're back in the garage with the freshly machined rotors, it's time to hop back into replacing the brake lines and pads. Now I decided to finish up the front half of the car entirely before moving on to the back. So that meant after the brake lines were in that it was time to throw in the Hawk brake pads. So with a touch of grease on the contact points, I tossed the pads in, got everything reinstalled and tightened, and was able to step back and get a glimpse of the fresh brake setup. Now you could say what you want about machining rotors, but you can't say that this doesn't look better than how the setup was before. And I agree that the calipers could have used a touch up, but considering it's hard enough to squeeze into the garage around my work schedule and roommates doing stuff in there, I figured at least this leaves the door open for another potential episode where I do refresh these, or maybe even get into another braking setup entirely. We shall see. Now before we move on to the rear, I quickly want to remind anyone with an old project car like the E36 that most parts on cars this old, unless recently replaced, are likely due for replacement. And the reason I say that is because of this brake line right here. This came off of the passenger front corner, and it wasn't until I was replacing my coilovers a few episodes ago where I learned just how in need of replacement these lines were. Thankfully, I had already had the parts on hand to take care of this, but it could have very easily been overlooked and could have left me stranded had I taken it out to the track in this condition. So all that to say, if you have an old car, despite the mileage or condition you think it's in, there's a solid chance that parts like these should be checked out and potentially replaced, because you don't want to be left stranded or, even worse, end up in an accident if a part fails due to age and wear. But now that the front brakes are wrapped up, it's time to move on to the rears. Unfortunately, looking back on all of the footage, I realized that I didn't really film much of the rear brake line replacement, but much like the fronts, everything went as smooth as one can hope. That is until I finally got around to trying to run the new RBF brake fluid through the system. Now, unlike earlier in the episode where I applied pressure to the system without any fluid in the pressure bleeder, at this point it was time to fill it with fresh brake fluid so I can get the last bit of old fluid out, get the fresh high temp brake fluid in, and start bleeding the air from the system. But it was during this step that I ended up running into some issues. Alright, so the last clip where I was talking to you guys, I told you all I had left to do was bleed the car, and I was able to bleed it myself, but I did end up running into a little bit of issues. In typical 30-year-old car fashion, it did not go as smooth as I had originally planned. Basically, the front calipers, the front brakes were able to bleed pretty much like normal. With that pressure bleeder, I was able to apply pressure to the whole braking system, and fluid came out of both of the sides. But as soon as I got to the rear of the car, I couldn't get fluid to come out of either side, and so I ended up kind of having to troubleshoot. What I ended up doing is essentially cracking the line as I you know, as I got further or closer and closer to the caliper itself. So basically there's two brake lines in the rear of these cars on each side. And I cracked the line at each little junction, and fluid would come out and fluid would come out and fluid would come out. And eventually fluid came out of everywhere except the little bleed screw, which meant that there must have been something blocked, because the brake line that screwed into the caliper itself, when I broke it loose, fluid was coming out. So fluid was able to make it all the way to the caliper, but wasn't able to come out of the caliper. There must have been a blockage there, essentially. And so I started on the driver's side. I took the caliper out and ended up finding a block right there where the bleeder plug, like port, goes into the cylinder, like where the piston is. And so I was able to clean all that out. I got the hole cleaned up and then put it back in, and sure enough, it was able to pass fluid through the caliper. And then I ended up doing it again on the passenger side, and just like the driver's side, it was clogged. Hopefully that made some sense, but in case it didn't, let me try and clarify once more. Basically, I was getting fluid into the rear calipers, but that fluid was unable to make its way through the bleed screw due to debris blocking the port from within the caliper itself, which meant I couldn't fully bleed the system of the air that was introduced when the lines were replaced. And as you can see here, it's no wonder why. The caliper piston chambers were in need of a deep clean, and because of this, I suspect that when I originally attempted to pressurize the brake system to remove the old fluid prior to replacing the lines, that I ended up causing the blockage in the ports with the debris inside the piston chamber. And in case you forgot, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that trying to force the old fluid out before replacing the lines ended up paying off in more ways than one, and this is what I was referring to. Now, I'm not 100% sure whether or not the calipers would have ended up blocked had I not attempted to do that, but in a way, I'm glad they did, because it made me have to remove the caliper pistons, which led to me being able to clean out all of the debris and old fluid from behind the piston, while also being able to really dig into cleaning the bleed port. So despite the typical old car types of issues I usually run into working on this thing, this time around, it ended up being a blessing in disguise. But anyways, just wanted to give you guys a quick update. Now I have to go out and drive the car. There is a procedure for bedding these brakes. I believe I just have to get the car up to about 50 or 60 and do like 2 or 3 hard braking like applications, and then they should be broken in and we should be good to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I guess I'll update you guys after that. All right, I just got back from my test drive, and really quick, I do want to clear up the actual break-in procedure for these brake pads. It turns out it's 6 to 10 moderate stops from about 25 to 35 miles an hour without coming to a complete stop. And then after those 6 to 10, it's 2 to 3 aggressive stops from about 45 miles an hour, again, without coming to a full stop. So as I was out there doing it, dude, I've been giddy all the way home, because as I, you know, did the procedure, the brakes just felt better and better. The car stopped sooner and sooner, and I felt more and more confident with the car. And dude, it just gets me so excited to kind of see the transition from how the car was before to how it's becoming now. I was super stoked. I should have actually set you guys up. I mentioned in the last clip I didn't want to spend the time, but dude, I was like laughing all the way home, because the car feels really good. It's just every little mod I could feel the difference before and after, from, you know, old worn 30-year-old parts to the new parts I'm putting on it. It's really, really rad, and it's making me super excited to get out on the track and rip this car around. But anyways, I won't sit here and ramble too long. If you made it to this part of the episode and you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing. We are closing in really, really soon on phase 1 of this car. I have about a handful of parts left to go on before we're actually out on track and, you know, figuring out what else it's going to need from there. And then we'll get into phase 2 for the car. But yeah, like I said, if you want to see any of that stuff, definitely consider subscribing. And if you made it to this part of the episode and maybe you don't want to subscribe, either way, I just want to say thank you for checking it out, and I look forward to catching you guys in the next episode. Thank you for watching.